In August 2010, emergency responders in Rugby, Warwickshire, were called to a railway embankment that would scar everyone who saw it. There, lying in the mud, was the body of Gemma Hayter, a woman with learning disabilities whose only wish in life had been friendship and acceptance. What investigators uncovered was not just a brutal killing, but the collapse of every safeguard that should have protected her. This is the story of Gemma Hayter, remembered by her family as warm, loving, and desperate to belong. Her kindness, however, was twisted into vulnerability exploited by those who called themselves her friends. What began as small acts of manipulation escalated into humiliation, abuse, and on that August night, a betrayal so cruel it shocked an entire nation. As we trace the files, testimonies, and missed opportunities, one question echoes: how many red flags must go unanswered before action is taken? And what does it reveal about us neighbors, professionals, whole communities when someone like Gemma can be surrounded by danger yet left unprotected? Before we continue, let me be clear, this will not be an easy story to hear. We won't linger on graphic detail, but the failures revealed here are real, heartbreaking, and impossible to dismiss. Vulnerable people like Gemma should never be left to face what she endured alone. It is your awareness, your vigilance, and your willingness to act that give purpose to telling her story. Together, we honor Gemma's memory not by replaying her suffering, but by ensuring her voice does not fade into silence. On the quiet streets of Rugby, people still remember a young woman with a gentle smile and a hug. For anyone she met, her name was Gemma Hayter. Born on September 13th, 1982, Gemma was the youngest of 3 children in a working-class family. Her mother, Sue Prince, noticed early on that her daughter was different from her siblings. To her family, Gemma was like a child in an adult's body, trusting, affectionate, and deeply longing for friendship. In the 1980s, diagnostic tools for learning disabilities were limited, especially for girls. Medical records could not provide clear answers, but everyday life did. Gemma fell behind her peers, struggled to fit in, and was often the target of bullying. Her sister, Nikki Reed, later recalled, "The hardest part was that Gemma couldn't do the things other kids could, but it wasn't until she was 14 that anyone placed her in a special school." Years spent in mainstream education left Gemma with lasting scars of isolation. Even when she was finally moved to a special school in 1996 and later attended a residential program in Wales between 2002 and 2004, Gemma often slipped through the cracks. What began as small gaps in support gradually widened into chasms that could not be bridged. By 2008, Gemma herself tried to reach out. In a letter to social services written in simple, earnest words, she explained, "I want a job. I need independence. I want someone to help me when I ask. This is what I need and want in my life." It was not a complicated request, just the basic desire for autonomy, with a hand to hold when she needed it. Friends remembered Gemma as someone who would throw her arms around others, who would give away her last coin, who believed kindness would always be repaid with friendship. But that same innocence, that absolute trust, made her the perfect target for those who saw gentleness as weakness. And this is where the lesson becomes painfully clear. When we see adults with developmental disabilities living independently, we must ask, who is checking in? Who is making sure they are not being exploited? These are not intrusive questions. They are protective ones. Gemma's story proves that independence without adequate support is not freedom. It is abandonment. Striking the balance between autonomy and protection remains one of society's greatest challenges, and her case shows the deadly consequences when that balance is lost. They say tragedy rarely happens in a single moment. It builds, sign by sign, until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Gemma's story is the clearest proof of that truth. What happened to her was not a series of random misfortunes, It was a sustained pattern of warning signals that revealed a vulnerable woman steadily slipping through every safety net. By 2008, the storm clouds were already gathering. Police records show Gemma was living alone in a council flat, 10 stories of gray concrete, where isolation only deepened her vulnerability. The Serious Case Review later confirmed that she had been classified as having substantial needs as early as 2004. Yet, when she reached adulthood, that level of support was downgraded. A decision that looked bureaucratic on paper left a deadly gap in practice. Court documents revealed that by 2008, a pattern of financial exploitation had taken hold within a single year. Police were called 20 times for theft and extortion. Gemma's disability benefits often disappeared within days, with no clear explanation of where the money had gone. Orbit Housing recorded 67 separate contacts regarding rent arrears. Mental health services logged 64 interactions between 2006 and 2008, and her family made 30 attempts to check in and offer support. Each number was a red flag, but rather than being pieced together into one urgent picture, they remained scattered in disconnected files across different agencies. Diagnostic complexity made Gemma even more exposed. Professionals noted a learning disability, suspected autism spectrum disorder, and behavioral difficulties. In 2008, she was instead relabeled with behavioral disorder, a label that clarified nothing about her true needs, but distorted how others saw her. Gemma was trapped in a cruel paradox, considered too capable for full-time care, yet too vulnerable to live independently. This was precisely the moment when a community should have been on alert. When a disabled adult becomes estranged from family, constantly surrounded by exploiters, treated as entertainment rather than as a friend, that is no longer just unfair social dynamics. It is a visible pattern of abuse and exploitation. The flat that was meant to give Gemma autonomy ultimately became a prison of isolation. Neighbors recalled strangers coming and going at all hours, loud music, and the signs of drug activity. Yet because Gemma was, on paper, an adult with the right to choose her friends, almost no action was taken. The reality was painfully clear: independence without oversight and support was not freedom. It was abandonment. There are relationships often called friendship, but in reality, they can become like a tightening grip around someone vulnerable. For Gemma Hayter, this was not simply unhealthy contact. It was a pattern of manipulation and exploitation that gradually stripped away her independence. This is not an isolated story. Exploitative relationships like these happen around us every day. If you notice someone in your community being controlled by so-called friends, don't stay silent. Speaking up can be the difference between protection and tragedy. By early 2010, court records show that 5 individuals had taken over Gemma's life. Chantel Booth, 21, described in court as cruel, treated Gemma as a source of entertainment. Daniel Newstead, 20, carried a record of violence and drug misuse. Joe Boyer, only 18, showed extreme aggression. Jessica Linus, 19, even posted about the incident online with chilling indifference. And Duncan Edwards, 19, later became directly involved in the fatal events. These were not hidden figures. Police files had already noted disruptive behavior and drug activity. Yet when they appeared in Gemma's circle, the system dismissed it as simply her choice of friends, rather than recognizing the warning signs. This dynamic matches what is now called cuckooing, when offenders take over the home of a vulnerable individual to hide drugs or operate illegal activity. Gemma's flat was quickly turned into a base for crack cocaine and heroin. In her innocence, Gemma believed she was just keeping things safe for friends, not realizing she was being used as cover for crime. If you see a flat suddenly filled with strangers, constant noise, or other unusual activity, don't assume that's just their lifestyle. Sometimes, it's the sign of someone being taken advantage of. Speaking up early can prevent escalation. There were multiple missed opportunities. In May 2010, Gemma was assaulted, a clear shift from financial exploitation to open violence. Just 2 months later, she faced eviction for antisocial behavior. In reality, much of that came from the group using her home, but Gemma bore the consequences. Case files describe her as being in acute distress, yet no comprehensive assessment or intervention took place. Today, experts call this mate crime abuse carried out by those pretending to be friends. When a person with disabilities begins defending the very people harming them, giving away money, opening their home, and accepting mistreatment as the price of companionship. It is not simply sad, it is life-threatening. Gemma displayed nearly every classic warning sign, but no one connected the dots. So, pause and think. Do you know someone in a situation like Gemma's? Don't wait for absolute proof. Reasonable concern is enough to make a report. One phone call could save a life. And the haunting question remains, how could 20 police call-outs, 64 contacts with mental health services, and dozens of family warnings still fail to form a clear picture? The escalation from financial exploitation to physical violence, and ultimately a preventable death, was not unforeseeable. It followed a pattern that should have been recognized at any point along that path. Intervention might have saved Gemma. On August 7, 2010, a family friend named Fran Cutt noticed something deeply concerning. Outside a garage in the center of Rugby, she saw Gemma with Daniel Newstead and Chantel Booth. Clearly in distress, when Fran asked if they were forcing Gemma to steal, Gemma quickly defended them. "They're my friends. I'm helping them." This moment reveals how deeply the exploitation had taken root. Even when offered help, Gemma chose loyalty to those who were harming her. For vulnerable individuals, defending abusers is not a sign of free choice, but the result of dependency and manipulation. And it is at precisely this point that the surrounding community must recognize that such loyalty is in fact a silent cry for help. Fran confronted them, but like many other witnesses, she did not go further. Too often, people assume someone else will intervene, or fear that they might be mistaken. But when it comes to the safety of vulnerable people, silence is the greater danger. That evening, CCTV footage captured what words could not. The cameras showed Gemma being pushed outside a pub when she made a lighthearted remark about Booth's age. The group was ejected. Moments later, Gemma was shoved to the ground and struck across the face by Jessica Linus. The most disturbing detail was not just the blow itself, but the reaction of bystanders. Several people glanced over, then walked away. One later told police they thought it was simply friends having a row, a fatal misunderstanding of what was plainly abuse. This scene illustrates an uncomfortable truth a community watched, but did not act. Each passerby made a choice, and the collective decision to stay silent emboldened the group. In cases of abuse, the inaction of bystanders is not neutrality, it becomes a form of permission. Gemma's appearance at that time also told a story words could not. Bruises explained away as clumsiness, declining hygiene, rapid weight loss, each one a warning sign in plain sight, yet consistently ignored. A single question, a single report, could have interrupted the cycle of violence. Research shows that many abusive incidents occur in semi-public spaces, with witnesses who fail to act. In Gemma's case, every unchecked humiliation reinforced to the perpetrators that they could continue without consequence. The painful lesson is clear: bystander intervention does not have to be dramatic. Sometimes it is as simple as calling the police or asking the victim if they are safe. But to do nothing is to allow the harm to escalate. Before we go any further into the most difficult parts of this story, we need to pause and remember who Gemma truly was. For those who really knew her, Gemma was not defined by her vulnerabilities, but by her radiant smile, her love of music, and her simple, heartfelt wishes to have a job, to live independently, and to be loved just like anyone else. Her mother, Sue, recalls memories of a little girl who would spend hours carefully arranging stuffed animals, giving each one a name and a personality. Gemma remembered everyone's birthday, always calling to wish them well. And even as an adult, she carried a childlike joy feeding ducks in the park, laughing at her favorite television shows, or delighting in the small things. These memories remind us of something vital. Every victim in these cases is more than a case file or a statistic. They are whole human beings with inner lives, dreams, and potential. When we reduce them only to tragedy, we risk forgetting the very reason why change is necessary. That is why Gemma's legacy extends far beyond her own story. Her death forced social services to review their procedures, sparked new awareness around the phenomenon of mate crime, and urged communities to pay closer attention to the warning signs of exploitation. Today, every time a professional takes a concern seriously, every time a bystander chooses to intervene instead of walking away, a part of Gemma's light continues to shine. The story of Gemma Hayter does not end with memories of who she was. To understand the full scope of this tragedy, we have to look at what happened in her final hours. On August 8, 2010, Gemma went to Chantel Booth's flat on Little Pennington Street to collect some of her belongings. According to court records, she believed it would be another brief visit, the kind where she endured mockery or minor bullying from so-called friends. But this time, it escalated into 4 hours of violence, ending in her death. Before going further, it's important to stress the purpose of recounting these events is not to shock, but to underline why recognizing warning signs and acting on them matters. Violence rarely arrives without escalation. It builds through patterns. If bystanders or systems had intervened earlier, this sequence could have been interrupted. Forensic evidence shows the abuse began as soon as Gemma entered the flat. Her nose was broken, she was restrained with tape, and she was humiliated. A broom handle was broken during the assaults, and blood evidence on the walls confirmed the apartment had become a scene of sustained violence. This is where we must pause and ask ourselves if you heard shouting, strange noises, or signs of distress from a neighboring flat. Would you knock? Would you call the police? Or would you assume it was none of your business in cases like these? The decision of a bystander can be the line between rescue and tragedy. Gemma's phone was hidden and destroyed, so she could not call for help. And yet, even in that state, she trusted that the group would eventually let her go home. When they told her it was time to leave, she followed, believing the ordeal was over. This is the heartbreaking paradox. Gemma's most beautiful quality, her loyalty and trust, was weaponized against her. For vulnerable individuals, friends can sometimes be the cover for abusers. When someone defends those who harm them instead of seeking help, it is a red flag that the community needs to notice. We cannot wait for the signs to become undeniable before we act. Judge Rafferty later described Gemma's trust as loyal as a dog, a haunting phrase that underscored the depth of her vulnerability. The perpetrators even wiped blood from her face before leading her through the streets of Rugby to avoid drawing attention. Many people saw Gemma walking with the group that day, but no one asked questions. Put yourself in that moment. If you had seen a young woman with visible injuries being escorted by others, what would you have done? A single phone call could have changed the outcome. Instead of being taken home, Gemma was led to an abandoned railway embankment off Hillfield Road. In that dark and isolated place, the group continued the violence, ending with a fatal wound. Gemma was left alone in the mud. The perpetrators tried to burn her clothes to erase evidence, but failed, leaving behind forensic proof that would later form the backbone of the investigation. This moment forces us to confront a difficult question. How could a young woman be walked across town after hours of abuse without anyone stepping in? The lesson is not only in the forensic files, it is in the silence of bystanders. Every hour lost, every glance turned away, moved Gemma one step closer to her death. The investigation began immediately after a jogger discovered Gemma's body at 5:30 a.m. on August 9th, 2010. At first, the passerby thought it was just discarded clothing, but as they drew closer, the truth became clear: a young woman had been abandoned. Bearing visible injuries, West Mercia police quickly sealed off the scene. Detective Chief Inspector James Essex led the inquiry, promising they would work tirelessly to ensure justice for Gemma. From the very first evidence, investigators recognized this was not a random death. It was the outcome of sustained violence. Before delving into the details, it's important to emphasize the purpose here is not to dwell on horror, but to understand the missed opportunities for intervention. Every piece of evidence told a story not only of what had happened, but of moments where someone could have acted sooner. Forensics swiftly connected the dots. At Booth's flat, blood traces matched Gemma's DNA. Spatter patterns across walls and a radiator confirmed a prolonged assault. Tape used to restrain Gemma carried multiple fingerprints from the perpetrators. CCTV footage from the street recorded her final journey walking behind the group she called friends, her injuries visible to anyone who looked. This raises a painful question: how many people saw a young woman with bruises, stumbling after a group, and kept walking? What we see with our own eyes should never be dismissed as private matters. Sometimes, one phone call to police is all it takes to break the chain of tragedy. Digital evidence uncovered another layer of cruelty. On August 10th, just a day after the killing, Jessica Linus posted on Facebook, "Anyone want to know what happened on Hillfield Road?" as though the crime were gossip. This chilling indifference revealed not only the absence of remorse, but a willingness to treat violence as casual conversation. And here, once again, the lesson becomes clear: if brutality can be flaunted so openly, then community silence becomes even more dangerous. Too often, people assume someone else will report it, but every hesitation leaves more room for violence to escalate. Within days, all 5 suspects were arrested thanks to overwhelming evidence, but the Serious Case Review later acknowledged a devastating truth: the same level of urgency, if applied earlier, could have saved Gemma's life. The review identified repeated missed opportunities, rooted in poor information sharing between agencies. If police had connected the August 7th assault to Gemma's known vulnerabilities, if social services had recognized the escalating violence, if housing staff had shared concerns about criminal activity in her flat, any one of these could have triggered protective action. Witnesses also came forward late, admitting they had noticed troubling signs but assumed they were not serious enough to report. One neighbor described hearing screaming and banging from Booth's flat, but dismissed it as just partying. Another saw Gemma with a black eye the week before, but accepted her explanation that she had fallen. The investigation revealed a community that had normalized violence and ignored red flags. This was the deadliest silence of all. Every agency thought it was someone else's responsibility, and when everyone stayed quiet, Gemma slipped through every safety net. In September 2011 at the Old Bailey in London, the trial of 5 defendants began. From the very first day, the atmosphere was heavy. The courtroom was packed: Gemma's family, local media, advocacy groups, all aware that this wasn't just a murder trial, but a turning point in how society understood mate crime. When prosecutor Christopher Houghton QC opened, he spoke not only of evidence, but of the person at the center of the case. And when CCTV footage showed Gemma being led through the streets of Rugby in her final hours, the courtroom fell into suffocating silence. Some spectators broke down in tears, and Judge Rafferty had to pause proceedings. It was no longer scattered data or case notes, but vivid truth: a young woman, injured, still following those she called her friends. The prosecution built its case on 3 pillars: forensic evidence, digital traces, and eyewitness testimony. Gemma's blood, DNA matches, tape carrying the defendant's fingerprints, text messages and missed calls showing she had tried to reach out for help. Witnesses who saw what happened but did not intervene. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer blow, closing off every possibility of denial. Meanwhile, the defense scrambled. They highlighted the defendant's youth, troubled backgrounds, and drug use. Some tried to shift blame, insisting they were merely going along with the group. But the narrative collapsed under the weight of reality. This was no accident, but hours of sustained cruelty, calculated and carried out together. In her summing up, Judge Rafferty called the killing a chronicle of callousness. She said plainly that Gemma had been treated like a toy, abused for entertainment. She singled out Booth as wicked. Most of all, she emphasized that Gemma's vulnerability made the crime especially appalling. They exploited her simplicity and her trust. The verdicts were decisive. Booth, Newstead, and Boyer were sentenced to life imprisonment, with minimum terms of 21-20 and 16 years respectively. Linus and Edwards were convicted of manslaughter, receiving 13 and 15 years. The sentences were not only punishment, but a stark reminder. Society has a duty to protect the vulnerable, and silence in the face of abuse can never be justified. In a moment that stilled the room, Gemma's mother, Sue Prince, read her victim impact statement. She said, "She was killed by 5 people. None of them stopped. None of them reported it. I don't understand why. I love Gemma and I miss her every day. I fought to get her diagnosed and cared for. I don't hate them. I pity them. Their lives are sad and wasted." Her words, from a grieving mother, carried more weight than any sentence could. In a courtroom filled with cold evidence, Sue's compassion exposed a stark contrast: love and forgiveness on one side, callousness that led to death on the other. This trial did not simply close a case. It etched into public consciousness the reality of mate crime, abuse by those posing as friends, escalating from petty exploitation to deadly violence. And it underscored that justice is not only in the verdict, but in learning how to recognize, prevent, and act before such tragedies repeat. In 2011, 1 year after Gemma's death, the Serious Case Review was published. Independent expert Kathy McAteer did more than list mistakes. She mapped out a path toward preventing such a tragedy from happening again. Her conclusion was stark: Gemma's death may not have been precisely predictable, but a stronger support system could have significantly reduced her vulnerability to exploitation. The report highlighted lethal gaps. Gemma was never given a Mental Capacity Act assessment, despite the 2005 law existing precisely to determine whether a vulnerable adult could make safe decisions about finances and daily life. Had such an assessment been carried out, the dangers might have been recognized early and protective measures put in place. Beyond that, the threshold for intervention was set dangerously high. Financial exploitation and social isolation were not treated as seriously as physical abuse. By the time Gemma met the criteria for full safeguarding, it was already too late. Fragmentation of information deepened the void. Police knew of assaults. Social services knew of her vulnerability. Housing officers logged antisocial behavior. Mental health providers understood her limitations, yet no one ever pieced the fragments together. McAteer called for fundamental reform, improved data sharing, regular multi-agency risk assessments, and targeted strategies to confront crimes committed under the guise of friendship. She also underscored the role of community culture. Too often, people hesitate to interfere in the relationships of adults, even when exploitation is obvious. The report stressed a vital truth: safeguarding is not about stripping dignity away. It is about preserving it. Finally, McAteer pointed to innovative support models such as shared lives or keyring, where vulnerable adults live within trained families or community networks that offer both autonomy and safety. And she made one blunt point: prevention is far cheaper than failure. A murder investigation can cost millions, while providing timely support may cost only thousands. The case of Gemma Hayter forced a national reckoning in the UK on how society protects vulnerable adults. Disability organizations reported a surge of families seeking help finally with a name, mate crime, to describe the exploitation they had long witnessed but never had the language for. MenCap, the leading learning disability charity, noted that many victims never come forward, some because they did not recognize it as abuse, others because they feared losing the only social connection they had. Statistics underscored the scale of the problem. The Equality and Human Rights Commission found that harassment of disabled people was often minimized, treated as inevitable rather than as crime. Recorded disability hate crimes increased by more than 300% between 2011 and 2018, reflecting either rising violence, better reporting, or both. Behind every number was someone like Gemma, vulnerable, craving connection, yet falling into the hands of those who saw weakness as opportunity. Public pressure forced authorities to respond. Les Caborn, from the local safeguarding board, publicly apologized to Gemma's family. "We cannot turn back time, but we are determined to learn lessons to protect others." Wendy Fabro, Director of Adult Social Care, pledged reforms, enhanced training for social workers, lowering the threshold for intervention, and stronger interagency communication protocols. Gemma's death echoed across borders. In the U.S., the killing of Jennifer Dougherty in Pennsylvania in February 2010 revealed a nearly identical pattern. A 30-year-old woman with developmental disabilities lured and tortured for 3 days by the very group she thought were her friends. In the UK, the murders of Brent Martin, 2007, a young man with a learning disability beaten to death by 3 friends, and Fiona Pilkington with her daughter Francesca, 2009, who took their own lives after years of unchecked harassment. All revealed the same truth. Gemma's case was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a systemic chain of social failure. Her legacy lived on through awareness and action. In 2019, the BBC aired the documentary Gemma, My Murder, bringing her story to millions. The film was not about shock. It was about education, teaching viewers to spot warning signs and understand their own responsibility to act. Gemma's sister Nikki became an advocate, emphasizing if society treated everyone with kindness and respect, things like this wouldn't happen. No one is born cruel. But if we stand by and allow cruelty to escalate, we become complicit. Today, training programs for police, social workers, and healthcare staff embed those lessons. They stress that when a vulnerable adult suddenly forms friendships with a group of young offenders, it is not simply a lifestyle choice, it is often a red flag for grooming and exploitation. Unexplained injuries, financial hardship despite receiving benefits, withdrawal from family, or fear disguised as loyalty are now recognized as warning signals demanding immediate investigation. The story of Gemma Hayter forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about how society treats its most vulnerable members. She asked for help dozens of times throughout her short life. Professionals identified warning signs hundreds of times. Members of the community witnessed exploitation and abuse. Yet, Gemma died believing that those who killed her were her friends. Following them in trust to her death along a dark railway embankment, this is not only the story of individual cruelty, it is a story of systemic failure at every level. Each agency that failed to share information, each professional who did not escalate a concern, each bystander who chose not to act, all of these contributed to a preventable tragedy. The 5 young people who killed Gemma bear direct responsibility, but they acted in a context where the exploitation of vulnerable adults was tolerated, minimized, and ignored. But to stop at failure without learning is to achieve nothing. Today, we understand mate crime better. We recognize that vulnerable adults need both independence and protection, not one or the other, but both together. We know that friendships with young, aggressive individuals are not harmless social connections, but potential exploitation. We understand that financial abuse and social isolation are not just unfortunate circumstances, they are forms of abuse. The changes made since Gemma's death improved information sharing, lower thresholds for intervention, and greater awareness training about mate crime have saved lives. Each professional who now takes a concern seriously, each family member who recognizes a red flag, each community member who reports rather than dismisses suspicious behavior contributes to a safer world for vulnerable adults. Be a voice for those who cannot protect themselves. Report concerns today. Your call to adult safeguarding services, your conversation with a worried family member, your refusal to ignore exploitation may save a life. Gemma could not recognize the danger, but we can. Her trust was beautiful, but it was deadly. Our vigilance must be her legacy. Remember, protecting vulnerable adults is not about restricting their freedom, but about ensuring their safety. Independence without protection is not dignity, it is abandonment. When you see someone unable to defend themselves being systematically exploited, your intervention is not intrusion, it is compassion in action. Gemma Hayter deserved better from the systems meant to protect her, from the community that witnessed her exploitation, and from a society that failed to value her vulnerability as something worthy of safeguarding. We must ensure that others receive what she was denied: recognition of their worth, protection from predators, and the chance to live with both independence and safety. The final question is one we all share. What kind of society do we want to be? A society that protects its most vulnerable members, or one that abandons them to predators? A society that acts on warning signs, or one that waits until it is too late? A society that values all human life, or one that deems some lives expendable? The answer we give, not in words, but in action, will determine whether there will be more Gemmas, or whether her legacy becomes one of transformation.